Okay, so get this. Some plants out there can literally just clone themselves, right? While others absolutely desperately need a partner just to survive to the next generation. Now, this isn't just some quirky trivia fact you memorize and forget. What we're actually looking at here is a high-stakes survival strategy. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're breaking down asexual versus sexual reproduction, the plant's ultimate survival strategy. If you're studying for your O-level biology exams, understanding these mechanisms isn't just about, scraping by and passing a test. It's about understanding how life literally adapts and thrives on our planet, and mastering the exact mechanics we're going to cover today, well, that could easily be the difference between a B and an A. All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for this Explainer. We're going to cover strategy, clone or partner, then asexual versus sexual reproduction, the anatomy of a flower, the pollination process, fertilization, and finally, we'll wrap up with some crucial exam tips and traps.
So moving right into Section 1, strategy, clone or partner, the ultimate strategy.
What's really fascinating here are the absolute non-negotiable stakes at play. Reproduction is the biological process through which organisms create new individuals, and species continuity, that is the ultimate objective. Without this mechanism functioning properly, the only other alternative is extinction. Literally, every single adaptation, every beautiful petal, and every microscopic cell division we're about to look at today, it all exists for this one singular purpose, keeping the species alive.
Moving on to Section 2, asexual versus sexual reproduction. Two completely different survival toolkits.
Okay, let's break this down. Notice the direct contrast here. Asexual reproduction requires exactly one parent. At a cellular level, that single parent cell divides using a process called mitosis. You can think of it like a biological photocopy machine, just stamping out genetically identical clones. Boom, boom, boom. Now on the flip side, we have sexual reproduction. This requires two parents, or at least two distinct types of gametes. This process uses meiosis, which really mixes things up genetically and results in high genetic variation. See how those two processes completely diverge?
Let's drill down into that word meiosis really quickly, because it's super important. Meiosis is cell division that creates haploid gametes, basically cells with exactly half the standard number of chromosomes. Think of them like puzzle pieces, right? When one haploid half and another haploid half physically fuse together, they restore the full, complete set. This creates a diploid zygote. So two halves literally come together to make a whole new, completely genetically unique individual.
All right, Section 3, anatomy of a flower. Let's look at the macroscopic machinery.
Now, every single part of a flower has a hyper-specific job. As we look at the core organs here, we've got the petals on the outside. Moving inward to the male parts, we have the anthers, which are supported by these stalks called filaments. Then, right in the center is the female reproductive tract. You've got the sticky stigma up at the top, this long tube called the style, leading all the way down into the ovary, which of course houses the ovules. This entire structure isn't just pretty to look at. It's a highly intricate, perfectly designed reproductive engine.
Let's look at how the physical design of just two of these structures entirely dictates what they do. Look at the petals first. They're usually really large and often super brightly colored. But why? Well, their explicit function is to act as a giant beacon to attract pollinators like bees or birds. Now check out the anthers sitting up at the top of the filament. Their job is pure manufacturing. They produce the pollen grains, and tucked inside those tiny grains are the essential haploid male gametes we just talked about.
Okay, on to Section 4, the pollination process. This is the transport phase. The absolutely crucial point here is nailing down the exact definition of pollination. It is simply the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Watch that physical journey, starting right at the pollen-producing anther, flying through the air or riding on a bee, and landing squarely on the receptive stigma. That whole trip, that is pollination. But as you might guess, there's actually more than one way to make that trip happen.
Let's compare the two main transport paths we see here. First, self-pollination. This is where the pollen stays within the exact same plant. The big advantage? Well, it works beautifully even if pollinators are incredibly scarce. It's an amazing backup plan. The downside, though, is low genetic variation. Now, for cross-pollination, the mechanism involves moving pollen between entirely different plants. The disadvantage is that it absolutely relies on external agents, like bees or the wind, to cross that physical gap. But the massive advantage? High genetic variation, which is a huge boost for the long-term survival of the species.
Moving into Section 5, fertilization and seed development, we've reached the final stage.
Let's walk through this sequence chronologically. Notice how one step actively triggers the next. Step 1. The pollen grain lands on a compatible stigma. Step 2. The pollen germinates. Step 3. This is the wild part. A pollen tube physically grows all the way down the style, creating a literal tunnel directly to the ovule. And finally, Step 4. The male gametes travel down that newly built tube and physically fuse with the female gamete to create the zygote. Remember, pollination was just the delivery service. Fertilization is that final, actual fusion.
All right, Section 6, Exam Tips and Traps. Time for some tactical O-level biology prep.
Here's a classic, high-frequency exam prompt you're probably going to see. Describe the differences between asexual and sexual reproduction. When you see this exact prompt, I want you to immediately remember the two key variables we contrasted earlier, the parent count and the genetic variation. One parent and identical clones means asexual. Two parents, or two gamete types, and distinct genetic variation means sexual. Lock those two exact variables into your answer, and you will easily secure full points.
Now pay really close attention here, because this next one is an incredibly common trap. Students constantly, and I mean constantly, confuse self-pollination with asexual reproduction just because it happens on one single plant. Do not make this mistake. Self-pollination is still a form of sexual reproduction. Why? Because it involves gametes. It involves the fusion of pollen and an ovule. If gametes are fusing together, it is sexual reproduction. Period. Full stop.
And here's another major trap. Assuming all flowers use bees and bugs for cross-pollination, you've got to pay attention to the anatomical structures. If an exam question shows you a diagram of a flower with tiny, dull petals, and these anthers just hanging way outside the flower on long, loose filaments, well, that structure tells you the vector. That is a wind-pollinated flower. The plant structure tells you exactly how its mechanism works, so always let the diagram guide your answer.
All right, let's do a super quick rapid-fire recap to really solidify these mechanics in your brain before test day. Ready? 1. Reproduction equals species continuity. 2. Asexual reproduction means one parent and genetically identical clones. 3. Sexual reproduction means two parents, gametes, and genetic variation. 4. Flowers are the macroscopic reproductive organs that house the microscopic gametes. And 5. Pollination is the physical vector transfer that makes fertilization possible.
And that brings us to a final question for you to chew on. Are you just going to memorize these definitions flashcard style, or will you truly understand the incredible survival mechanisms driving them? When you sit down for that exam, I challenge you to actually draw out the flowcharts in your margins. Visualize those vector arrows moving from anther to stigma. Understand the why behind the what. Because if you can start seeing the plant as an active, highly mechanical survival machine, those tricky exam questions honestly won't stand a chance. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.